Well, a very good morning to you. My name is Alison Common, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special webinar, where we're going to be focusing on promoting decent work in platform work. It's brought to you today in association with the International Labour Organization, the International Organization of Employers, and the World Employment Confederation. Now, we've assembled for you the leading experts in the subject to present you with the very latest data and, of course, their years of expertise. So you can leave here today informed and ready to take that conversation back to your own colleagues and your own industries and sectors. Now, I do, of course, want to take the time to thank you for joining us in our virtual world. We know it's not the same as being in the same room and hearing from you and seeing you and networking, of course. But there will be ample opportunity to hear from you as well. Although I suppose I should ask one vital question. Maybe we can get a show of hands. Who's actually here watching in their pajamas today? Now, as I said, although I can't hear or see from you, the ample opportunities are there to interact with us. We encourage you to have your say and direct your questions to our panel of experts later in the event, following what we know will be a very lively and informative discussion. Questions can be sent through the Q&A box on Zoom, and we welcome as many as possible to make very best use of our panel of experts. And of course, if you've any queries at all, just ask Anna. She's there for you on the other end of the button on your Q&A box in Zoom. And the forum, of course, as you know, will be recorded, so you can watch it back and study it at your leisure later on in the day. Now, to our topic today, and just as all the new technologies that have hit the labour market, working through online platforms have grown over the last couple of decades. In fact, as we will hear shortly in more detail, the past decade has seen a 5-fold increase in the number of digital labour platforms, which are concentrated in just a few countries. The number of online web-based and location-based platforms rose from 142 in 2010 to over 777 in 2020. 29% are located in the USA, 8% in India, and 5% in the UK. Now, with that growth has come new work opportunities and responsibilities, including those for women, people with disabilities, young people, and those marginalised in traditional labour markets, and also, of course, a greater flexibility amongst a workforce with varied skills. But it's a sector which is also posing a very unique set of challenges, such as employment status, information available to the workers about their working conditions, dispute resolution, collective rights, and non-discrimination. There's a fear, I suppose, that the standard full-time and dependent employment relationship is under pressure. And in the future, many individuals will be working in flexible work arrangements with little employment and social protection, few benefits and rights, and limited access to training. However, the debate sometimes does get ahead of the facts, and policymakers need to be careful to base any decisions they make on evidence rather than anecdotes, and as well as a balanced consideration of all the arguments. And we'll provide you with all those tools here this morning. Now, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, I managed to get this far without mentioning the C word. It's amplifying the urgency, challenges, and opportunities of platform work. Social partners and government need to work together to ensure it contributes to decent work and economic growth in the post-COVID environment. The need for ongoing international policy dialogue is paramount, and conversations like today, which inform and educate, are vital to the future of the success in the industry. Now, just before we hear from our guest speaker, I want to remind you to send us your questions and comments using that Q&A box section in your Zoom panel. So, for our first speaker today, please may I introduce Uma Rani. She's senior economist with ILO, and this is presenting her 5 years of work, 2021 World Employment and Social Outlook Report. Uma.
Thank you very much, Alison, for the short introduction. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me into the discussion forum. And I'm very happy and delighted to present the World Employment and Social Outlook 2021, the role of digital labor platforms in transforming the world of work. This report actually focuses on how digital labor platforms are increasingly shaping the future of work and are also becoming a part of our everyday lives. It discusses the transformations digital labor platforms are bringing about to the world of work. As already mentioned, the past decade has seen a five-fold increase in the number of digital labor platforms globally, concentrated in United States, India, and United Kingdom to a lesser extent. At the same time, the rise of such platforms has also created a growing digital divide between different parts of the world, as 96% of the investments are invested in Asia, North America, and Europe, and only 4% are invested in Latin America, Africa, and the Arab states. Across sectors, the investments are again disproportionately in the taxi sector, followed by delivery and hybrid platforms, which provide a whole variety of services and online web-based platforms. Further, in 2019, we observed that about 70% of the revenues are actually generated by digital labor platforms concentrated in just two countries, the United States, about 49%, and China, about 23%. Europe, it's about 11%, and other regions constitute 17% of the revenue that is being generated. Now, this rise in the digital labor platforms has been enabled largely due to the availability of technological innovations like cloud computing and cloud infrastructure and the use of big data and algorithm. These developments have been supported by the availability of venture capital funds, and the result has been innovative ways of working and flexibility for both workers and businesses. And the COVID-19 pandemic has further reinforced their role in the economy. These platforms are also increasingly redefining how economic relationships are established through technology between workers and clients or customers around the world. There are three ways in which these platforms are actually transforming the world of work. The first is through the algorithmic management practices of allocation of work, which you see in the left-hand side of the slide, which includes not only the allocation of tasks, but also evaluation and monitoring and reward for work. Second is through changing the organization of work and the work processes. This is one of the major shifts that is happening, where the entire responsibility of investing in capital assets is pushed on to the workers, be it cars for the taxi drivers, or if you're talking about computers for online web-based platforms, including that of the operating costs, which includes whether it is electricity bills, whether it is internet costs, or fuel for taxi drivers. And also for the online web-based platform workers, it is also the space in which they actually perform their work. Now, this makes platforms very asset-light. And the third fundamental difference that it is bringing about to the way we conduct business or organize work is the creation of a dual labor market, or what can be also called as a segmented labor market, with a core workforce of internal employees to actually manage the platform and a large external mediated workforce that actually executes the task and who are often not part of an employment relationship, as a result of which they do not get many of the other benefits that the core workforce normally enjoys. Now, this report actually looks at different types of digital labor platforms, those on location-based, that is taxi and delivery, and also those on online web-based, whether it's freelance, contest-based, microtask, or competitive programming platforms. Now, what we have seen in this report is, despite the diversity in types of digital labor platforms, the business model has some very common elements. These relate to the way work is allocated and what is taken into consideration. It is often the ratings, the client reviews, the profile of the workers, and on online web-based platforms, it's also the project history or the portfolio of the workers that is considered. All of them, the core or the fundamental value proposition of their business model is that of the way the revenue is generated. And all these models either have a commission fee or they have a subscription plan to actually attract both the workers and clients. All the platforms also have very clear work processes and the way performance management is evaluated. And they use different type of monitoring devices or tracking devices. It could be digital tools or certain algorithms to evaluate how the work is performed. And last but not the least, but which is very fundamental, is the way the rules of governance of these platforms undertake, and that is unilaterally determined by the platforms. A worker or a client or a customer does not have much choice but to agree to the terms of service agreement if they want to access these platforms. And there are a lot of rules that are laid down there, and we'll touch upon some of them in detail later. But what is very important is to highlight the entire issue of exclusivity clauses, how accounts can be deactivated, and lack of dispute resolution mechanisms in much of these rules of governance of these platforms. There's an entire chapter that is dedicated in the report, which actually looks quite a bit into the detail about these platforms. Now, to assess the potential impact of digital labor platforms on workers and businesses, the report draws on the findings from surveys and interviews conducted by the ILO with some 12,000 workers in 100 countries and representatives of 85 businesses around the world in multiple sectors. Now, the current wave of technological advances, such as cloud computing and availability of cloud infrastructure, has opened up new means of outsourcing work through online web-based platforms, which enables businesses to access workers with a wide range of skills and expertise from across the globe. These platforms have been gaining prominence among both workers and businesses despite a digital divide. From startups to Fortune 500 companies, many of these businesses have been using these digital labor platforms because they bring significant benefits to businesses as they can access workers and source talent globally. A number of enterprises use this for recruitment purposes, but also to get the tasks done so that they can reduce costs and improve their efficiencies. Businesses also use these platforms to access knowledge for innovation. Many of the small and medium-sized business enterprises, in particular, also use location-based platforms to expand their customer base. Online platforms also support the growth of have also supported the growth of AI digital technology startups, and it provides them with opportunities as many of these companies can source lots of tools through open source platforms and set up their own businesses. At the same time, this has led to a proliferation of many AI startups across the globe. In addition, we find that many of the erstwhile BPO companies are actually transforming and expanding with digital labor platforms. While there are opportunities, many of these businesses also face a number of challenges which relate to unfair competition, high commission fees, lack of transparency in algorithms, and adequate digital infrastructure. The report, as rightly mentioned by Alison, also shows that digital labor platforms are creating new work opportunities, providing flexible working arrangements for certain workers, such as women, persons with disabilities, or young people. We find that majority of the workers on these platforms are below the age of 35 years. It varies depending upon the platforms, like in competitive programming platforms, it is about 22 years. And if you look at some of the delivery platforms, some of the location-based platforms like taxi, it is about 49 years. These workers are often highly educated, particularly in developing countries. They're mostly men, but women are also finding work on these platforms. On online web-based platforms, we find that 4 in 10 workers are women, while in location-based platforms, 1 in 10 workers are women. Now, the question is, what motivates these workers to perform tasks on platforms? They're very different depending upon the kind of sector you choose and the kind of platform you're talking about. Now, on freelance and microtask platforms, it is largely to complement pay and because of the flexibility it allows. On competitive programming platforms, they allow a lot of youngsters to improve their skills and to develop a rating or a ranking that allows them to have good career opportunities on offline work. On taxi and delivery, one of the reasons that was often cited by the workers was lack of alternative employment opportunities and flexibility and better pay. This has to be looked into a context because we are talking about developing countries and labor markets where you find that often these are sectors where you find low educated workers, but increasingly on platform-based work of taxi and delivery, you find highly educated workers actually getting into these jobs. So this raises, in general, an issue about the employment policies and employment creation policies in many of these countries. For many women, both developing and developed countries, work from home or work flexibility was another important motivating factor. Apologies. Platform income or platform work is also a main source of income for many workers. For microtask workers, it's about 32% of them who said that, and it ranges from across on taxi drivers and delivery workers to about more than 80%. And for freelance workers, it's about close to 60% of the workers for whom it is the main source of income. And I think this makes it very, very important for us to look at the issue of, can we think about decent work for platform work? But while this is a main source of income, availability of work is a main challenge for these workers. On online web-based platforms, 9 out of 10 respondents wanted to do more online work, but half of them said that it is not available, either sometimes because they are not better paid or because there's not enough tasks that are there. On delivery platforms, 69% of the respondents wanted to complete a greater number of deliveries, and 83% of them could not do so because of lack of availability of work. Now, earnings vary across countries and again, across the types of platforms. We find that hourly earnings on microtask platforms are about 3.3. On freelance platforms, it's about 7.6. And if we take online web-based platforms on an average, it's about $3.4 per hour. And this is across the globe. And we find that about 50% of the workers actually earn less than $2.1 per hour. We have to keep in mind that these are very highly educated workers who are actually performing these tasks. Now, if you look at location-based platforms, they earn about, depending upon the country, as we did the survey in about 12 developing countries, it varies between $1.1 to $8.2 in taxi and less than $1 to about $3.5 in delivery. Now, in general, we do find from our findings, as we did a comparison between traditional and app-based platforms, that location-based platform workers earn more than that of the traditional counterparts. But this has to be analyzed with caution. The first caution I'd like to mention is that we are doing an analysis after the entry of a taxi platform within the country. So a lot of opportunities that would have been with the traditional taxi sector has actually got lost because there is a reduction in demand for many of these workers, which has also resulted in increase in working hours and has had an impact on their income. Whereas on location-based platforms, whether you look at taxi or delivery, where you find the earnings to be very high, these workers work very long hours, and this is something you'll see in another slide. And one of the reasons they do that is not only to earn sufficient income, but often on these platforms, there are various bonus and incentive schemes to lure these workers to actually hang around working longer hours so that there is supply of workers 24/7 to meet the demand which comes intermittently at different hours throughout the days. We also observed that there are differences between countries and gender. Workers in developing countries tend to earn about 60% less than those from developed countries on freelance platforms. And there's a significant gender pay gap on some platforms at the country level, while globally we find that the findings are quite mixed. Another issue that I'd like to highlight, which is very important within the context of the platform work, is that most platform workers, especially all of them on freelance and on taxi, actually pay a commission fee to get access to, which is a part of their earnings, but many of them also pay fees to access work, to improve their profile, to withdraw their fees, sometimes withdraw their money from their account, and also for currency conversion. And the commission fee itself ranges between 20 to 35% on online web-based freelance platforms, and it ranges between 5% to 25% on taxi platforms. And some of the taxi platforms, we also found workers were paying about 40%. If one were to deduct all these different types of fees, the earnings that the workers often get on many of these platforms ranges between 50 to 65% of the income that they were promised to earn. Now, this practice of charging fees to workers is quite contrary to the international labor standards, whether one is talking about the ILO Protection of Wages Convention 1949 or the Private Employment Agency Convention 1997, which prohibits agencies, employers, and intermediaries from charging any fees. Now, further, COVID-19 has impacted availability of work and incomes for many of these workers. On online web-based platforms, supply has been rising faster than demand. On location-based platform, many workers had to take break from working, and we found that 9 out of 10 taxi drivers and 7 out of 10 delivery workers reported a decline in demand. For 90% of the taxi drivers and over 70% of delivery workers, COVID-19 had consequences for financial situation of the household, and they adopted various measures, including reduction in consumption, reducing their staying into a smaller space, or moving out to towns and villages so as to reduce the cost. And many of them also borrowed money to actually tide over the crisis. Now, there are huge issues with regard to working hours, which has risks on occupation safety and health. This is true of both the online web-based platforms as well as on location-based platforms. We found that workers in general spent about 1/3 of their time, 1/3 of every hour, actually looking for work, which is often unpaid. And if you take a total week, it's about 8 hours of work that they spend looking for such work. In general, they responded that they work around 27 hours on average in a typical week. And about half of these workers also had other paid jobs, working about 28 hours on average. And this very clearly shows the precarity that exists in the labor market, which also forces many who are in the offline labor market to actually depend upon these online labor platforms to actually meet the income needs that they have, as many of them also responded that they complement their existing pay to tide over their minimum needs of their household. We also found that 82% of the respondents on freelance platforms indicated that they worked beyond the normal hours, which raises questions about the control and autonomy that many of these workers have, and also raises concerns with regard to work-life balance. On location-based platforms, in the taxi sectors, workers were working about 65 hours per week. There are some countries where it exceeded more than 75 hours per week. And the delivery sector is about 59 hours. Majority of the workers also reported feeling stressed due to their work, either due to traffic congestion, risk of work-related injury, or insufficient payment. And COVID-19 also has increased their occupation safety and health risks, as many of these workers could not afford to quarantine because they had to earn incomes, and they were often exposed to COVID-19, and sometimes even when the family members had COVID, they had no choice but to risk their lives and that of others to earn incomes. The other issue that we did find with regard to this work was there was very poor social protection coverage. Majority of the workers on digital labor platforms lack social protection. The huge gaps, irrespective of the indicator that you take into consideration, whether it's health insurance, work-related injury, unemployment, disability, old age pension, or retirement benefits, which leaves platform workers at risk, especially during COVID-19, which was very clearly exposed. On location-based platforms, we found that 7 out of 10 workers indicated not being able to take paid sick leave or receive compensation in the event they were to test positive for the virus. And if you just take one indicator, access to pension, you find that less than one fifth of the workers actually have any sort of a protection. Lastly, touching upon the workers, I'd like to mention about how algorithms are altering how workers are hired, evaluated, or remunerated, an aspect that was already mentioned earlier, which has implications on the access to work and also their earnings. Worker rating is decisive, irrespective of the platform we take into consideration. Work, if workers do not accept work, there are repercussions with regard to accessing work. Rejection of work and low ratings are very common among these workers on these platforms. And if they refuse or cancel work, it can have negative impacts, like not being able to access work, but also leading to account deactivation, which we found in both the taxi and the delivery sectors. And often many of these workers are unaware of a formal process for filing a complaint or seeking help. And this was something we observed on all the platforms, whether it is freelance, taxi, or delivery platforms. Often this work is highlighted as providing a lot of autonomy to workers and flexibility to workers. We found that workers were monitored regularly and tracked with regard to the nature of work they did and the amount of time they actually spent. This was true, especially on freelance platforms, and it was more than 40% of monitoring that happened, that was reported by the workers. Now, platforms are not only having an impact on the working conditions of the workers, but they also have an impact on the content of the work that is being done. Now, they're also redefining the relationship between formal education and access to workers, and we find that workers' education is not necessarily correlated with their income levels. Now, on freelance platforms, we did find that there was some sort of a good match between the skills of the workers and the tasks they performed for 62% of them. For remaining, this was not the case. You find highly skilled workers in medical and engineering and computer science doing low-end jobs. Competitive programming platforms provided opportunities to learn new skills or upgrade existing skill sets, while in microtask platforms, we found that highly educated workers were performing low-skilled tasks or mind-numbing tasks. And on location-based platforms, 20% of the workers were very highly educated, which is not something that you see it in the traditional sector. Now, working conditions, which are regulated by the terms of service agreements of these platforms, which has huge implications on all the different aspects that were actually presented just now to you. And it also challenges some of the fundamental rights that workers actually have, especially related to collective bargaining and unionization. But what we also found is that despite some of these challenges, workers have started to organize in some region, including through digital means. Now, the report further goes about to show that there are certain decent work elements that are applicable to all workers, irrespective of the contractual status, and these related to the fundamental principles and rights at work. It relates to some of the labor standards and in other ILO instruments, which are applicable to them, whether it's occupation safety and health, social security, access to labor inspection, or job creation policies. And we also find that there are other ILO instruments which are very relevant to platform work and can be brought within the core. These relate to payment systems, fair termination, access to data and privacy, clear terms and conditions, job mobility, access to dispute resolution. The report further provides a very comprehensive analysis of the regulatory responses in many countries that have started to address some of the issues related to working conditions. And it shows that diverse practices are being followed around the world. Governments have, in some cases, extended social security and occupation safety and health to platform workers. They've classified them as employees and not as self-employed. They've also ensured that they could have right to data access in some countries. It also shows some of the soft law initiatives that have been taken in national jurisdictions by governments and social partners, and how trade unions have also been helping many of the associations of platform workers to fight for certain legal challenges. To provide decent work in the context of platform-based labor would require ensuring application of some of the key labor standards to all workers, irrespective of their contractual status. This would require addressing the regulatory gaps by means of legislative responses in the 8 policy fields that have been outlined here, and so as to ensure that labor and social protection are provided to all workers. Apart from these 8 policy fields, it is also important to explore other fields of law for ensuring decent work and to shape the legal and policy space in which digital labor platforms and their workers operate. And these include the competition law and the emerging laws of artificial intelligence and taxation, which are becoming very highly relevant for workers on digital labor platforms. The findings from the report make it very clear that diverse regulatory responses at country level are not enough and adequate. Also because platforms operate all over the world across multiple jurisdictions. The only way to effectively protect workers and businesses would be through a coherent, consistent, and a coordinated international effort. And to achieve this, the report urges for international policy dialogue and coordination that would be vital to find common regulatory solutions and to reinforce the fact that universal labor standards are applicable to all workers. The report lays down about 15 recommendations about what needs to be done in this space. And the most important ones that I'd like to highlight is relating to the employment status classification, relating to right to bargain collectively, to ensure that there are adequate social security benefits to all workers, fair payments and working time standards, and there are transparency and accountability in algorithms and ratings, among all others which are becoming equally important for these platform workers. To conclude, I'd just like to say that, as mentioned before, the ILO's fundamental principles and rights at work and some of its key conventions and recommendations are applicable to all workers, irrespective of whether they are classified as employees or self-employed. They should enjoy the right to associate, to bargain collectively, and to be protected against discriminatory conduct and unsafe workplaces. This is something that has been highlighted by the ILO Director General Guy Ryder also. I'll conclude by highlighting a phrase which was rightly mentioned by the DG Guy Ryder at the launch of the report. What is unacceptable in the analog world of work should also be unacceptable in the digital world of work. And thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion and debate on this issue.
Thank you very much indeed, Uma. And I'm certain, well, I can tell everybody agrees that that was a really incredible report. Thank you very much indeed for compiling it, for researching it, and of course for presenting it here this morning. We have so many questions coming in off the back of that. It's great to see that everybody's so engaged while watching this. I'm sure you'll be able to address quite a lot of them yourself, typing the responses there. Can I just remind everybody watching just to send your questions in the question and answer box on the bottom right-hand corner of your lower panel there, rather than sending them to chat. It'll get to us directly there through those. We have so many, Uma. I'm just going to pluck one out here because I suppose it might cover a lot of people's queries. from Luis Carlos Malero Garcia. From a global point of view, what is the biggest challenge while addressing platform work? Could it possibly be of a legal or a social nature? I know we're under time pressure, but if you could just possibly touch what you think is the most important of those.
I think one thing is very clear, and that is that there needs to be a regulation of the digital labor platforms if we are to ensure decent work for platform workers and to ensure that they have decent working conditions. And as I rightly mentioned, that many of the labor standards that we have, irrespective of the employment status or contractual status, are actually applicable to these workers. So I think it's important that these are made available to these workers.
Okay, well, Uma Rani, you have been an invaluable resource for us this morning. I know that you're going to be able to hopefully stay and answer as many questions as are being posed there as possible. But for now, though, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, we do love hearing from you, and you are going to probably inundate us with questions after our next round of panelists. They are an ensemble crew of the best that we could find in the business to let us know here what we need to be discussing and what conversations we need to be having about promoting decent work in platform work. So just to introduce our entire panel for you this morning, we have government speaker from India, Mr. R.K. Gupta, Joint Secretary, Ministry of Labour and Employment. We have Roberto Suarez Santos. He is General Secretary of the IOE. We also have Sharon Burrows, Secretary General of the ITUC. And we have Bettina Schaller, who's the current President of the World Employment Confederation. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, all of you. We're going to be able to discuss quite many of those topics that we've heard there from Uma, and many more that you're throwing to us today. But first, I'd just like to hear from our first speaker. So could I introduce Mr. R.K. Gupta of the Ministry of Labour and Employment.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon from India. I must first of all congratulate ILO and Ms. Uma Rani, who has done commendable, excellent work, and the report is quite exhaustive, illustrative, and educative. Today morning, since today morning, we have been reading this new report so that we can answer some of the questions. What she has done, we have been trying to introduce a legislation on platform work and platform worker in India. It has been about 2 years that we have been trying to find out the challenges which are associated with having a legislation relating to the platform work. Obviously, there was always a need to capture as to who is the platform work, who is the platform worker. So we had no definition anywhere in the world. So we have first time captured the definition of platform work, gig worker, platform worker, and aggregator. So just to, can we move to the next slide? As has been told by the previous speaker, that out of 777 platforms, 8% of the platforms are in India. In addition, I would also like to highlight 1/3 of the total digital labor supply is from India. If 1/3 of the digital labor demand is from USA, but 1/3 of the total labor supply is from India. And many of our software development and technology digital workers are associated with this huge labor supply chain. So what we, as I have already indicated, we have defined the platform work, a work arrangement outside of a traditional employer-employee relationship in which organizations or individual use an online platform to access other organizations or individual to solve specific problems or to provide specific services in exchange of payment. In fact, we were really not sure how to capture the entire gamut of activities. So we have also provided, while defining the platform worker, that the kind of activities can be added later on. Gabriel, can we move on to the next slide? So we have, basically our intention was to provide them at least 9 benefits of which have been provided by the International Labour Organization. First of all, we have created a mechanism which is at the national level, a tripartite body representing employers, employees, and other state governments. This will consider the matters regarding welfare of workers in unorganized sector as well as for the platform worker. And we intend to formulate the policy for the benefit of workers through this National Social Security Board. Next slide, please. Now, the problem is because they do not have fixed pay, they do not have any wage. Where from we get the money? The slide before that, Gabriela. So the problem which we encounter is that where from we get the money to fund the various social security schemes. For that purpose, what we have done, we have introduced a contribution from the aggregator. Like in case of ride-hailing services, the Uber, Ola, from Swiggy, Zomato, we have asked them to pay between 1% to 2% of their turnover to the Social Security Fund. In addition, we also want the central government, the state governments, the provincial governments to pitch in certain money to contribute to this fund. And also we want to leverage the funds under corporate social responsibility. Next slide, please. So one of the problem which also we found, which I was mentioning, that how to classify the activities, how to classify the aggregators. So what we have done, we have captured in a schedule the activities which will be covered for the purpose of collecting contribution, like ride sharing services, Uber, Ola, food and grocery delivery services, Swiggy, Zomato, logistics services, e-marketplace for wholesale, retail sale of goods, professional service providers, healthcare, travel and hospitality, content and media services, any other goods and service provider platform. Now still we are finding it difficult. Like Amazon. Amazon is a e-market platform, but they do not have workers. So what we have done in order to increase the coverage of the workers or the platform workers, we said even if the Amazon, who is an aggregator according to our definition, will provide 1% of their turnover to the government for Social Security Fund, even if the services are rendered by workers through some other source, means directly or indirectly. Next slide, please. So first of all, since our act has been enacted, Parliament has already passed the law. Now this act is going to be implemented very soon. First of all, we were thinking implementation, how to provide the funds to a Social Security fund and how to have the schemes being formulated. So that I have already mentioned that we have created a Social Security Fund which will have various sources of contributions. Then now what is the wage? Because the government have to pay or the individual will have to pay certain amount to run the Social Security scheme. For that purpose, we are trying to fix a notional ceiling and the benefits which we intend to provide to all the platform workers in the first instance: medical benefits, sickness benefits, there would be annual medical checkup, maternity benefits, accident compensation, disability benefits. I must tell you that all these benefits would be at par with other regular workers. In addition to this, there are certain other law or guidelines which have been enacted or passed by the Indian government relates to only ride hailing services. Next, please. So as in the report, these have been beautifully captured, that still we are struggling with the definition. We are struggling with how to collect data and what should be those units of data, identification of activities to be covered as a platform work or worker. Apart from Social Security, there are other benefits which Ms. Uma has already flagged. their wages, minimum wages, working hours, the compensation, social security, other social security benefits. So, and also we also want to enforce all these rights through the regulatory mechanism. Other than social security, there would be a dispute. There should also be a dispute resolution mechanism, which we have not been able to do till now. So these are the challenges ahead, which we think. Thank you very much. I conclude my presentation with these few slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gupta. So much detail in this, in these particular discussions and the presentations that are being made. And you can see by the questions that we're getting in, they are coming in by the dozen. People really want to know. So we'll get as much information as we can. We're going to hear from all our panelists first before we start answering those questions. But just to remind you, yes, it goes into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And lots are asking whether Uma's presentation will be available. This entire webinar is being recorded, so therefore you can watch all of them back again. And all information, of course, is available on the ILO website there. So our next speaker will tell us a little bit more about their experience and background in this particular topic, and that's Roberto Suarez, General Secretary of the IOE.
First of all, I don't have slides. I'm going to make an oral presentation. I want, first of all, to have some thanking words, because we are one of the co-organizers of this event. First, of course, to our partner WEC. I mean, they have had always an excellent capacity to anticipate debates and also to work with us in areas that are really relevant and crucial, especially during this pandemic. So this discussion, which has to do with the digital reality and digital platforms and the way of work, is a needed discussion, and the fact of having a partnership with WEC, and I see here that in our presentations we'll have also Bettina Skyler will be the final speaker in this panel. It's also very, very important for us. I also want to thank ILO. You know, IOE is the voice coordinating business in the ILO. I mean, we are 100 years. And we are 100 years also since the ILO was created. Of course, our work does not finish in ILO. We are also working with other UN agencies, but having also ILO with us, and we just saw the presentation of Yuma, it's also important and relevant. And of course, I also want to thank our main partner in the worker side, Sharon Barrow, who is also going to join us. We can have many different views, and you will see now that perhaps we'll have different views on the aspect that we are going to discuss. But at the end of the day, the fact that she always engaged and she always is available to have this kind of discussions already says a lot about the kind of partnership that we have, and also the looking forward approach that both organizations, IOE, ITUC, and also WEC, have on this matter. So I wanted to just start with that because I think it's important. I want to refer to the WESO report, but beyond that, I mean, the WESO report is a report of the ILO that is produced every year on a specific topic. It's very thorough. It has an important degree of depth in areas that are important. Normally, what we expect as employers, as business organizations, is an evidence-based approach, meaning by that the report and the research provide us the data and the evidence and the trends and the facts that help us as constituents of ILO to make also decisions, okay? So we have been working with ILO and with ILO research department on this area. We have had some exchanges. Unfortunately, we were not able to see and I'm not blaming anyone, the report at the level, but at the last stage of the report itself. But we have to recognize that the data that is provided is not just interesting, but it's also pertinent. We have disagreements with the report, and we have important disagreements. First of all, because we think that the recommendations should be proposed by the constituents of ILO. It's not to the research department to make a recommendation or proposal, it's for constituents. So We understand that as a research department product, but at the end of the day, these policy discussions that Yuma referred to are discussions that we need to have in the proper manner in ILO. Let me just go to the content and also to see to provide you what are our views in relation with the trends that we are witnessing now in the digital reality, and also how this is affecting the world of work. We should not forget that we are in the middle of a pandemic that is going to create big uncertainties. It's already bringing these big uncertainties, but also crises, and some devastating consequences for workers, for individuals, and also for companies. We have been working closely on the need to preserve business continuity. The digital era, and we have witnessing that now, offers important and huge opportunities, but also challenges. Huge opportunities linked to the fact that you can have, and that has been explained, important areas of incomes, important areas also of flexibility according to the needs, not just of the employers, but also to workers. Important areas also of improvement in terms of training and skilling. You can have access to skilling in a much more accessible manner and cheaper manner, and very reputed skilling. You also have important source of incomes, also not just in developed economies, but also in developing economies, where you see a middle class also that is using these sources of income for precisely or complement, or also to strengthen the capacity to obtain some gains that they did not have before. And you can see that very, very often in some emerging countries before the pandemic, but now also during the pandemic with more intensity. By the way, the remote work angle, I mean, the fact that more people are working remotely is due to the pandemic, but there are important estimations, at least in developed economies, that will remain as a solid trend after the pandemic. So it's something that will come here. It's also important to, and I think Yuma referred to that, to well explain that to some extent, some of the disadvantaged groups that were excluded in a face-to-face working relationship could have some, if well channeled, could have more opportunities. And we see that more and more the online web services are taken by more than women, and the report referred to that, than by men. So there's also a gender angle that we should not underestimate. And also there are some questions in the chat function regarding people with disabilities, and how this group of more vulnerable groups could also be to some extent integrated in a better manner in the workplace through also the digital platform. Again, the main challenge, and we want to insist on that, and we'll discuss that, the main challenge that we have is that these opportunities, important opportunities, will not come to everybody. And they will not come to everybody because the access to internet is missing in 60% of the people living in developing economies. That's why we consider that as a matter of urgency, and ILO should be focusing on that, and the international community needs to act urgently to address the persistent gap between those able to benefit from the digital age and those who are left out of it. This should be the main focus of our discussion. What kind of infrastructure, what kind of digital literacy, what kind of training, what kind of mindset you need precisely to avoid this gap that is going to increase inequalities in the very short term. So let's also focus on that, which is a point which missing also in the report that has been presented, with all respects. At the same time, we want also to refer to some of the challenges that has been addressed in the report. We recognize also that many small and medium companies are already benefiting from access to markets, access also to cross-border markets, thanks to the digital platforms. The number of startups have increased intensively, not just during the pandemic, but before, due precisely to this new digital reality. But I have to recognize, and we want to be very clear on that, that there are challenges, first of all, in relation with employment relationship. What is one of the main problems that we see, main challenges, is that this employment relationship sometimes is not well defined at the national level. By the way, in the ILO, we have not been able to have a definition of employment. Believe it or not, is such a difficult topic because of the diversity of jurisdictions that there is not a single provision in any ILO convention of the 120, almost 200 conventions that have defined properly what an employment relationship is. So that's one of the main challenges, because when we see what's coming in terms of digital trend, is that on one side we have employees that should be covered under an employment relationship. We have also independent workers that to some extent should have some protections. And I think that the distinguished representative of the Indian government, who we also want to thank for joining us, refer also to the steps that they are taking also to giving some coverage for some of these independent workers. But then also we have a kind of mixed figure of individuals that are not properly independent, not employees, and there are some jurisdictions that are creating a kind of new gender, new angle, new category of workers to provide some rights. I have to say, and Sharon, I'm sure that she will refer to that in the Centenary Declaration of the ILO, we agree on the importance of having a kind of minimum for every worker, okay? And that's also an area where we are attached to. We don't want to escape to that. So at the end of the day, we have to recognize that these basic rights are applicable to all individuals. But we need to make this distinction between the different employment relationship on one side. Also, we need to be aware that the diversity of jurisdictions is creating a degree of complexity that is not easy to handle. And also we have to be realizing that there are already many answers being provided by different regulations, by different jurisdictions, judicial decisions, and you can see that, and also sometimes by the social partners themselves through collective agreements. So there is already a trend there. We also want to recognize that sometimes what we have is an issue of fair competition, and we see that very, very often in the geolocation workers. For that also there is a need. I don't know whether sometimes it's to regulate, sometimes it's just to implement existing regulation. There are different options there, but we will not deny also this fair competition. Another point that is missing in the report. The report is referring to workers using digital platforms, digital labor platforms. On one side, it classifies it with geolocation workers, so workers using the geolocation systems like Uber, etc. And on the other side, it classified it also with workers using online web services for translation purposes. But you have many known web platform applications like Upwork, like People Per Hour. Many of them are very known, but it's not addressing the fact that you have more and more individuals that are not using these platforms, but are working remotely. And that's also a challenge, and it's a challenge, but also it's a source of big opportunities. And there is no measurement by now on how this trend of workers, individuals working remotely using digital means, but not exactly digital platforms, are evolving. We also recognize that there are issues related to data protection, and we are very much attached to the need to have proper, not just regulation, but proper implementation of this regulation in terms of certainty for companies, and also issues related to coverage, share cost, sometimes exclusivity, etc. But at the end of the day, what we are also witnessing is a new reality of work in which concepts like working time and working place are changing. I mean, the way we work, and we see that in a daily manner, is not based, at least for a percentage of workers, I'm not saying that that can be generalized, in the number of hours they're working, even though we need to have limits from a health and safety perspective, but also from a fair perspective. But the way we work is not based in terms of working time in the same manner that that it was already 5 or 10 years ago. But also the concept of working place is also changing. And that has to do also with the new reality of the digital trend. Just to sum up my intervention, what we are clear is that we need adequate regulations, not necessarily more regulation, but adequate regulations. Sometimes the existing ones can be valuable. Sometimes there's need to modify them, to modernize them. But more than that, we need proper implementation. And don't forget that 60 or 70% of the occupied population in the world is in the informal sector. So what we need is also to see how this digital reality can really help to promote formality. And in many cases, there are ways to do that, to give them access to these digital realities, but also to channel this access in a way that they can become, with proper incentives, more formal. Bear in mind that a very high percentage of the informal workers and workers informal in the informal sector already have access to mobile phones, not perhaps to internet, but already to mobile phones. And there are many already initiatives trying to also to help them to have a much more decent conditions through formal means. So there is a way also to bring these regulations and to implement them if we incentivize also proper promotion from informality to formality. So there is a need also for a dialogue, and that's one of the messages that the report refers to. There is a need for international dialogues, policy dialogues, and we are able and willing to enter into that, but also there is a need for dialogue at national basis. And sometimes the answers are much more realistic when you bear in consideration the national and diverse realities that you have in a national context. We are ready not just to discuss, but we are ready also to take action with our partners, but also with the focus on leveraging opportunities arising for this digital revolution. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Roberto Suarez Santos. Absolutely. You've touched on so many points, and honestly, you should see the amount of questions as well that have come in for you as well. So we will get to hear from you again when we throw the questions out to the panel at the end of hearing everybody's presentations. So you can go off and half listen to our next speaker and then half answer those. Be prepared for answering them when we go live again. But for now, we will hear from our next speaker, and that is Sharon Burrows, Secretary General of the ITUC, to give us her take on some of the topics we're discussing today.
Good morning, and indeed, thank you to Uma, who has provided an incredibly comprehensive report, and one that was so important because there's a lot of myths and distortions around this sector of the employment market. First of all, let me say, from our perspective, a worker is a worker is a worker. And Guy Ryder said it when the report was indeed introduced, that rights, fundamental rights, must underpin all forms of work, including digital platforms. You can't separate a world where we're working with technology and a world where you're working physically with or without technology. So for us, it's not about the technology, it's about whether decent work exists. And I have no interest, frankly, in any employer that wants to simply exploit workers so they don't have to take responsibility for an employment relationship or an equivalent, which means they have to actually deal with rights, with adequate minimum wages or incomes, and of course with occupational health and safety and some control over working hours, particularly in this sector, most often characterised as the right to disconnect. What we know is that we already have the framework. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that implementation is easy, but we shouldn't be arguing about the framework because we did that in the ILO Centenary Declaration. We actually negotiated Indeed, Roberto and I were there, instrumental in agreeing on what should be the basis of rights and protections for all workers. And that floor is very simple. It's fundamental rights. You all know what they are. They are indeed the right to freedom of association, the right to or to join a union, or indeed an employer association, the right to bargain collectively, to be free of discrimination, forced or child labour, and occupational health and safety was added to that list. Fundamental rights, occupational health and safety, and then an adequate minimum wage. For us, that's an evidence-based wage on which people can live with dignity. We're not talking about very high incomes. Now, wages, incomes, we can work it out. It's been indeed the subject of many, many decades of collective bargaining in industries that didn't quite fit the traditional go-to-work, one employer profile. The entertainment industries, a case in point. Bargaining for a fair contract price floor is absolutely within our experience. So setting a minimum income, and I'll come back to that and why it's so important. And of course, having some control over your working life, and we specified maximum hours of work. But in addition to that set of rights and protections, we said universal social protection had to be absolutely part of the mix. And I would like to refer back to the report because it showed you several key things. One is, in many cases, the majority of cases, the overwhelming majority of cases, where an internet-mediated job is the reality, or a number of jobs, there is no one taking responsibility for any of these protections. There is quite often no compliance, and I want to come back to the question of compliance. But it's also true that there is no control over hours of work, safety, or indeed an income on which you can live with dignity. And I'm talking about the floor. I heard what Roberto said about people may choose to work, or to supplement their income. That's a very nice idea for people who have that choice. For the majority of workers in this sector, and we're not talking about very high income workers, we're talking about that wage level, which is quite disgusting, really, of less than $3 a day. If you actually look at the wages or the income base, then you are forced to work 2, 3, 4 jobs, whether it's in this environment or a mix of environments, because you can't earn a living income. That has to stop. The world is up to 7 times richer in the last 30 years, and yet we have seen a labour income share that has just continued to slump. That is why there's so much anger from despair, and why there's so much distrust in institutions, in our governments, in democracy itself. And no business can flourish without appropriate democratic rights and foundations. So if you go back to the solutions and you look at a couple of other areas we need to address, the gender question is absolutely, again, instrumental. But when you look at the Centenary Declaration, it again recalled that we need a transformative agenda for the inclusion of women. And when you look at this sector and see why it's dominated by women, sometimes that's about impediments to the labour market itself. We know that all too well when you look at the disproportionate participation rates of men and women. Sometimes it's about simply hiding the burden of care. And we must invest in vital public services, in care, healthcare, education, childcare, aged care, if we're to lift the burden of women of care off women wherever they work. But when women are trying to struggle with an internet-mediated job and indeed care, then a lot of other things are at risk. We know the increase in domestic violence when people have been forced to work from home. We know that indeed mental health is on the rise. And we also know from talking to many employers who were actually, in the interim, kind of attracted to the fact that they could sell their buildings and work remotely and organise this. Mind you, that's a kind of fantasy too, because only 30% at the maximum, and we're nowhere near that, we're at about 17 or 18% of workers could possibly, and I'm talking in the formal sector, so quite a small number could possibly work remotely at this point. So, but now many of those employers are saying, well, yes, we're going to have some kind of hybrid environment, but they're looking at offices and the design of offices to bring their people back to work. And then if you go beyond that small percentage, then, you know, factories are integrating a mix of technology as well, or other physical settings. So for many, many workers, the luxury of this kind of work doesn't exist. But what we can't allow to happen is that an expanding sector, because it is expanding, is actually without the rule of law. And that's exactly where we are now. So getting the rights and compliance and protections in place, there should be no argument. We negotiated them, they're there, let's implement them. There are, of course, challenges to whether or not direct employment is in fact simply being disguised or avoided. And those court cases will continue. We have to have those court cases, and you saw most recently the one in the UK, but that's not the end of it. We need to make sure that these conditions of work are in place. It's about a social license to operate. And if business is not prepared to operate within the norms of a regulated labour market with those rights and conditions, then I'm afraid it's not decent work. They're not decent businesses, and we need to overcome that. What I will say is that compliance has a role in this as well, because even if you get all of those settings, we know that it's much easier to actually avoid compliance if you're not indeed visible on a regular basis. So labour inspectorates, labour courts, alternate dispute resolution mechanisms, along with the power for remedy and indeed significant sanctions must be in place. We know that the UN Treaty around business and rights, human rights, will not be exclusionary. We know that the EU is moving to mandate due diligence, and indeed the OECD is reviewing its guidelines, and we hope they'll become binding. It's not about punishment. You have to have sanctions with the rule of law, because if people don't want to provide decent work, then they won't. And that needs to be challenged in the interests of fair competition for other employers, because employers who do want to do the right thing, then they need to be protected as well. And of course, the emerging, environment around the loss of privacy, the data theft, the surveillance workplace that's growing with all of this has to indeed be regulated and held to account as well. So we have a lot of work to do in implementation. But anybody who wants to go back and argue a new set of standards and rights, I think is just obscuring the reality that this is work. It's work, and it should be decent work. It should indeed be aligned and be able to be tested against the ILO conventions and standards. And of course, it must be in line with SDG 8. Otherwise, anger, despair, desperation, whatever the motivation for that anger, will grow, and that will be to the detriment of business as well as people. It's time for a model of economy, a business model, in whatever form it takes, with or without technology, that does not try to evade responsibilities for decent work.
Thank you very much indeed. Some very strong points there, and I'm sure you will also get some questions directed at you, as have the other panelists. So thank you very much indeed there, Sharon. And I am looking to see that it's great as the panelists are coming off, they're able to address the questions that are pertinent to them directly. And we will get to the rest of them as much as we can when we've heard from our final speaker just for now. And that is, of course, Bettina Schaller. She is president of the World Employment Confederation, and she will take us through what she sees as the most important issues that we have to tackle at the moment.
Thank you so much, Alison. And let me also start with big words of appreciation to all the speakers and contributors that we've heard so far. Of course, Uma, the ILO, thank you so much. What a flagship report this is, and there is no doubt that this will be one of the reference reports going forward. Uma, you've been working at this for over 5 years. You shared with us earlier. I can assure you World Employment Confederation has been looking at this topic for about the same time. A big appreciation, of course, also to Roberto and the IOE. Roberto, you've mentioned the immense energy and work that you and your organization have put into this key topic. And I can only say we will continue to count on you on that, of course, going forward. And it will be with Sharon. Sharon, you are the stern defender of rights of all workers. And if there's one discussion where this is, of course, absolutely key, it is this one. And then Secretary Gupta, you have brought to us the incredible steps that have been taken in India in the past months. The figures, of course, of the report and your own figures show it. You've said 1/3 of the world's supply is in India. So clearly, as you move ahead in this process, I can assure you the world will be watching India on this one. Now, the World Employment Confederation represents private employment services across the world. And those services include, of course, amongst others, well, agency work, recruitment, and career management services. Through these, we seek to support and to improve the labor market functioning, and we seek to enable work, prosperity, adaptation, and security. Like any other industry, private employment services have increasingly leveraged new digital technologies to provide services to match people to jobs, to support careers, and to promote sustainable labor market participation for all groups of workers. Those technologies, of course, include platform technologies, and it's through these that online talent platforms are created. And so really my contribution is about this specific element, the online talent platforms in this big discussion. Online talent platforms are a distinct category of online platforms that is focused on supporting job seekers, workers, and business find a sustainable labor market match. Now, private employment services actually have a history of disruption and very much recognize how changing economies, new technologies, and labor market demand and supply set the scene for new ways of working. As private employment services developed across the world over the past, well, many years and 50 years in an organized way, I'd say, they've worked with trade unions, with employers, with governments to ensure that their services support decent work and economic growth. I can assure you this ambition has not changed with the arrival of the technologies that we all call platform work. And it's building on that tradition that we put forward the conditions for platform work to contribute to decent work, and even, we've heard it already, as a pathway out of formality, and as we hopefully also hope, as a way for a job-rich recovery coming out of this crisis. Now, let me talk about those conditions, and we see 3 of them. First of all, it's about embracing the potential. Technology has always delivered better labor market outcomes. We truly believe that this time is no different. Those with proper access to digital infrastructure and skills can leverage platform technologies to find new sources of income, better balance working, learning, caring, and living, and develop their careers and employabilities in new ways. Moreover, these technologies could drastically reduce administrative burdens and as such contribute to the formalization of work and business and improve governmental oversight. As such, we do think that the bottom line of these technologies is positive for workers, businesses, and societies alike, if, of course, certain conditions are met. But to deliver on this potential, social partners and governments on the national level need to guide the adoption and ensure that decent work and a level playing field for businesses is given. And that's why let me get to my second point, which is that we think it's about untangling the forms of work beyond the digital interface of platform work. Indeed, World Employment Confederation identifies that platform work can and is being done through all recognized and regulated work arrangements that we've known for many years. This includes open-ended, fixed-term, self-employment, and agency work, which is, of course, as we know, the triangular employment relation that is recognized and regulated, as we heard from Uma in Convention 181, the EU Agency Work Directive, and many, many regulations across the world. In the same fashion that we see a vast diversity of business models through which platform work is being provided. Indeed, we've heard it, some seem fancy and new through the smartphone app, but some, if not most of those services behind the app have actually been around for many years. We've had them in transformation, we've had delivery, we've had IT, we've had outsourcing, and we of course had recruitment agency work, so the so-called online talent platforms that I mentioned before. Therefore, platform work is diverse. It is done through all kinds of work relations, and it's provided through all kinds of business cases and service providers. And that's why we think that no one-size-fits-all regulation will capture it. Moreover, as we've heard the court cases across the world are showing, platform work is very much covered by existing regulation on the national level already when the right classification is done. And that's the key, isn't it? At this stage still, it is classification. And when we say classification, it's classification of worker status, but it's also, as we know, the classification of the services provided. Classification was and still is the bottleneck if we seek to deliver decent work and a level playing field. Because indeed, irrespective of the technology involved, similar services need to comply with the same regulations. And those businesses that comply with worker status regulation should not have to compete with those that do not. And that brings me to the third point, which is social innovation. Although fundamental, classification will not allow us to leverage these new technologies to the fullest. The new technologies allow for a next level of dynamic and opportunity for workers and business that our current labor market infrastructure insufficiently accommodate or enable. We've heard it. We need to future-proof labor market rights, benefits, and infrastructure because they need to be of value add to workers and businesses. Clearly, what has worked till now will not take us to the future. So as the world of work changes, we need to adapt these institutions to continue, but also to safeguard our progress towards the mandate of the Centenary Declaration, especially as we recover from this pandemic. And we think that social innovation is a tool to do so. Social innovation allows to adjust institutions to a more dynamic economic and labor market reality. As addressed in the ILO Centenary Declaration, the custodians of the labor market, governments, workers, and businesses will need to mitigate those transitions now. This is, of course, why we meet today as well. This means that we need to work together to move away from rights and benefits based on a specific way of working, specific sector, or a particular employment contract, and ensure that the following elements are available, irrespective of the way people engage with work or which technologies are involved. And let me cite those 5 elements. First of all, we've heard it, I can only reiterate it. It's respecting the ILO fundamental principles and rights at work. Second, it's that shared responsibility of workers and businesses to safe and healthy work environment. Third, it's creating the portability and transferability of benefits, especially for training as well, across jobs, sectors, and forms of work. Fourth, opportunities access, and incentives for training and lifelong learning. And lastly, well, access to private employment services to support those labor market transitions. Ladies and gentlemen, let me finish with reiterating that this is where private employment services stand to play their part and to support the delivery of decent work and economic growth and the Centenary Declaration. As always, we seek to support workers and business as they navigate the labor market in order to promote sustainable and quality labor market matches wherever they are needed. The new technologies will allow us to deliver on that promise and to provide decent platform work through our services. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much indeed, Bettina. And can I welcome back all our panelists so that we can delve a little bit deeper. And we will, I assure you, get to as many questions that you're posing to our panelists as possible. We will tease out so many, as you can see, some very unique perspectives from each of our panelists today. And that is the issue here, isn't it? This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. We're not going to be able to come to a conclusion today, but this is what we need to hear. We need to hear from the regions. We need to hear the difficulties that each different region faces, and indeed each different industry we're talking about here as well. It's really interesting. We're getting so many questions in to see where they're coming from. We've got viewers here today from Cambodia, Tunisia, India, the Netherlands, and each one is posing particularly different questions, I suppose, and issues and concerns. So perhaps I could just throw out to everybody there, really. You have given us your take from your own point of view, but what do you see as the main challenges for workers, employers, and governments? Perhaps you'd like to answer some of the particular questions that have been coming into you off the back of your own presentations. Who'd like to start? Perhaps Mr. Gupta, you started first there, our presentation. Has there been anything that has particularly caught your attention with the questions that have been coming in?
Thank you, Alison. I have already answered 3 questions. I can read them out.
It's okay. Perhaps you'd give us an indication of the questions, and then we'll see if it will also give some sort of an indication from the rest of the panelists from their point of view.
Okay. The question is by Uma Rani. Albert. This is, can you, what is the question? Read out at the moment. What level of regulations are there in the platform workers? Because what we have provided is through legislation. Number 1, the definition has been provided. Second, a contribution has been provided, which will form the part of the Social Security fund. From that fund, we will provide benefits to the platform worker. Any violation like non-giving of contribution, non-payment of contribution will become an offense and will be a sort of a regulatory mechanism. Besides this, a board has been set up which will formulate the policies for the platform workers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Does that make sense to everybody else there? Is that something that could be used across the board, or that could be used as a policy?
Yeah, I think so. And the question is regarding, because there has been a confusion or there has been a dilemma, how to handle the workers, those who are permanently employed or employed on a regularly basis, and they also take up the platform work. So in our definition, we have not excluded the regular workers. So if a person in the mornings is employed on the regular basis and in the evening take up the job of a driver, he will be covered or she will be covered under the benefits which are provided under the Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, I suppose I did ask quite a general question there. You did touch on them in your own presentations, but what are going to be the main challenges, do you think, for each particular, we're calling them sectors. I don't know, Sharon, we called it a sector there and I use that term. Is it a sector? What does everybody think?
No, I think the challenges are same, which have been reflected in the report given by ILO. Number 1 is the definition. Although representative of employee, the worker was saying worker is a worker, but who is a worker? because as of now, in the entire world, there is a employer-employee relationship. A driver can put his vehicle with 3 or 4 platforms. Like he can be with Uber, Ola, Meru, or any other platform. So with whom we should have the employer-employee relations. So first challenge is, what is a platform work or worker? Second is the data collection, because the question of data collection and the uniformity in data collection can only be dealt once we have a segregated system of data collection. Third is, like somebody has already asked, what are those activities, what are the works which can be classified as a platform work? For that, what we have done, anything which can be done through, which is done through the platform is or technological platform is a platform work and the worker. And what we have done, we have added a schedule to our act. As and when the new form of platform work emerges, we will add that work or activity to the schedule.
It strikes me though, if we can't even agree at the moment with what the employer is called, whether they're an employer or no employee, we are really still quite at the basics here. Roberto, who should be looking after I suppose, defining the roles? Is it government? Is it the employee and the employer?
It has to be government, because if you have to.
Perhaps Mr. Gupta, I could just address another one of the panelists here. We'll just let everybody get in and get their opinion as well. Roberto.
But I am also very happy to listen to the Labor Secretary. But anyway, I think he already gave us some important hints. First of all, I want to insist on the very first point I said. The main challenge is the digital divide. 60% of the individuals in developing economies do not have access to internet. That's going to give us important problems. So if we just focus on those who are already in, and we forget that those that are out will have poor conditions, poor working conditions. Well, I think that, and also not access to training, not access to competencies, not access, then we will be losing the focus. So I want to very much insist, the main challenge is how we strengthen infrastructure, access to digital means, but also digital literacy. Having said that, what we have is a challenge also in terms of what is an employment relationship. Let's recognize that. And we have a model of employment relationship, which is very much the model that we have been following outside the digital world. But in the digital world, we'll have some important points because sometimes it's very difficult to define who is employer. Some jurisdictions are already giving answers, and it's difficult because that sometimes it presents itself as a network. And sometimes the difficulty comes because it's not exactly an employment relationship. There's no this kind of dependency. But sometimes, and Sharon referred to that, is simply a disguised independent contract. In fact, it's an employment relation which is disguised as an independent contract. So there is a strong problem of implementation. In terms of nuance, it's clear that when there is a disguised employment relationship, we need to be clear. I mean, we have to stick to our values, and we have to say the employment relationship should apply with the fundamental rights, but with all the rights that are applied, because also it's a question of fair competition. And
it is, and that's what we really need to talk about, is the fact that it's not a level playing field, both with
exactly.
we're talking about technological revolution, I suppose, but how can we assist policymakers in making that field a level, and how can we help bridge that digital divide? Perhaps somebody else would like to take that one. Sharon?
Well, I'm sitting here kind of confused about why we're doing what we always do, which is aggregating all of the so-called problems, when if you strip them away, the real problem is implementation and compliance. And that's about regulating the labour market. So when I hear the minister say that, the minister, co-minister, I'm not sure, sorry, Mr. Gupta. Joint secretary. When I hear, the fact that India wants a new regulation, a new piece of legislation to carve out these workers, I sit here and think, well, we wouldn't be opposed to talking about that through the unions globally and nationally, perhaps, but why? Why do you need that when the rules of the game are clear already? And that's why when, Roberto, I think you'd agree with me, when we looked at the floor of rights and protections, we actually didn't go for new regulation. We didn't go for, a kind of suggestion that this was a separate sector of workers, although sector is something people use. It's the platform employment arm, sometimes of major companies, sometimes of a set of services. So we often complicate things when really it's about saying, how do we ensure compliance rather than, whether we need new rules of the game. We might, but in the first instance, we don't. Not if you're going to just take the Centenary Declaration pieces. Let's put that in place first for all workers. And then you have the question of whether or not, indeed, you said it, Alison, you said, well, sometimes you can't identify the employer. And I'd say, really? This is the same in the taxation and corruption debate. If you don't have a register of workers, and we talked about this in a totally different context around Bangladesh yesterday with Roberta, if you don't have a register of workers, people who are doing work for you, and you don't have, and the government doesn't have registered employers, whether they're global or domestic, actually employing those workers in their own country and a register of employers, then I'm sorry, but you don't have a regulated labour market.
Well,
it's not about,
we're also sometimes presuming that it's the employer who doesn't want to have that regulation.
No,
also,
no.
the employee, the worker themselves sometimes don't want to be above the radar. I see, Bettina, you wanted to come in there. So,
well, let me just say on that, I'm unforgiving on that. If a worker doesn't want to be recognised as a worker, then they're simply not indeed operating on a basis that will provide others the opportunity for decent work. How can you find someone for social protection? How can you find someone for lost income? You can't have an industrial relations environment where there isn't some kind of transparency of contract.
Yeah, and Alison, thank you. Maybe let me pick up exactly that point. Fully agreed. I think the days of being under any radar are just over. It's just not feasible anymore. And, if there's something we've seen in this pandemic is the unbelievable support measures that governments have put out there to workers, and actually to workers where previously it didn't seem possible. So it's just shown that, governments as well see it. But again, it's not only governments. From the perspective of workers, put yourself into the formal economy. It's just, I know it's easier said than done, but it's, in certain countries and even in European countries, it's actually almost a bit of a mindset thing. Yes, there is the framework, but it's a mindset thing. And the same for businesses. Come on, we have entered the phase, call it what you want, responsible, sustainable. I don't care what the word is, but we have to all contribute to this piece. But let me come back to maybe what I actually wanted to allude to again, and you talking about challenges and opportunities, and really give this one perspective again of agency work and the question of do we now need regulation for platform agency work? No, we don't. Please do not, because we have very good existing regulation for agency workers, and when they are being recognized and classified, Sharon, when they're being recognized and classified, via online talent platforms, then the regulation of agency work applies. So, and it's both again on the side of the solutions that online talent platforms might deliver. If it's agency work that they deliver, then the agency work regulation applies. And the same again on the worker side. So we would be one of those constituents that say, please, let's use again the frameworks that have been built. They've been the fruit of, tripartite long negotiations, and let's just apply those to the digital world.
I've been watching.
Can I just step in there, Alison? Like Bettina and I don't see are not at odds with each other about rights, wherever the worker is. But you can't say this is an agency worker when in fact they could be simply working for BHP or Anglo-American or some huge construction company or whatever. They're a direct employee. And even where, depending on where you are in the world, even if you're an agency worker, there's an employer employing the agency. And so there's often direct and several responsibility. Plus there's ILO standards that cover all of that. So again, I know that's not what Bettina meant, but I just ask that in fact the ILO standards aren't diluted for this group of workers or that group of workers. They exist for all.
Okay, Mr. Gupta, wanting to come in there, is it on this particular issue? Because I do just want to move on to another subject just in one moment. Would you like to reply to that, Mr. Gupta?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I agree with both of you. The idea is to provide maximum protection, all equal, same rights as regular workers. But I will give you some example. I will start in the reverse fashion. Like there have been agitations by the drivers organization. There have been agitations by the organizations representing delivery boys. Now they are saying, give us better working conditions, give us, put some limit on the working hours, give us the accidental insurance, give us other benefits. Now, I don't know in India or anywhere in the world, who will address those agitation, who will address those grievances. So it means you need to recognize that they are workers. So how the recognition will come? Recognition will come only through regulation. I think please don't mind. I'm saying unless you create a new category of worker, how the relationship will be built? And now because there is a worker who works for 4 employers, and if accident takes place in a particular day, then how would you identify who will compensate and with whom you will settle the dispute? So
well, I'm not in the same room as Roberto, but I can see he's bursting to get in and comment on that. Roberto.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm silent. No, yes, that was the part that was missing in my previous intervention is, yes, when you have employees, it's clear that we have to be all clear, but then we have to recognize that there is a category of workers that is coming that are, you could consider them as independent, but they are not so much independent. And there's some solutions that are being provided. And that's what I think the distinguished representative, the Labour Secretary of India, is referring. And you can see that in many regulations. And there we go to the social protection part that Sharon and we are very much attached to it. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to build sustainable social protection, and we want to insist very much on this sustainability, but we have to look at ways of covering individuals that by now were not so much covered. Of course, there is a cost element, but that has to be carefully handled in terms also considering that also a kind of investment, because at the end of the day, we are all interested in having a safety net, okay? But yes, there is a new category of workers that is coming that is not exactly an employee. They are working in a network, but they should have some rights, which are important. And I think, Sharon, the Centenary Declaration also referred to that, okay? So that's where we are. Some of them will have perhaps working time limits, not exactly the same as employees, but we have to be, and there are solutions being provided.
I'm just watching some of the other questions coming in, and one topic that is coming up again and again is the subject of how this might benefit or how this might relate to refugees and people with disabilities. Does the data suggest that labour platforms should play a crucial role in job creation amongst refugees? What are the risks? Also, with respect to migrant workers, since workers can access the platforms remotely, how would this affect migration flows, since presumably the worker would not need to migrate for platform work? So some very different issues there with regard to migration working and refugee workers. Who'd like to discuss that?
Well, refugees are a very different category. Refugees indeed usually leave their country because of war-torn strife or persecution or harassment or some other form of a situation that means they can't live there anymore. Nobody willingly simply picks up and moves and calls themselves a refugee. But the question of migrant workers, it's mixed. Again, you've got to look at the nature of the jobs. For some, yes, it might be an answer, indeed, to stay at home and seek global work. But it's a very small percentage. First of all, internet connection, and look at where the countries are. And secondly, look at what the jobs are that migrant workers go to work in. And recall that, again, migrant workers don't, I mean, some people are nomadic and want to move and want to experience, but it's this tiny, tiny fraction of quite reasonably well-off workers. Most migrant workers move again because they can't get a job to feed their families. It's a choice they wouldn't make if there were real jobs there. So yes, but again, be careful about romanticizing this. It will be a very small percentage.
I see another question coming in from Anne-Marie Munst. She's, of course, a former president of the World Employment Confederation. And we could talk about this for days and days because there's so many different strands to it. But just to introduce something new is the platforms we know have been dominated, I suppose, by the likes of taxi and delivery services. We've mentioned them there, but there will be others. She would like to know, what's the fastest grower in the other bios? What issues should we be aware of then further down the line with these emerging bios? Everybody's thinking, who wants to take this one? What will be the emerging sectors or bios, as we call them? Anne-Marie would like to know.
I'm not sure I understand the question. If it's who is going to let the contracts, then you could look at a portion of almost every industry that we have. So, you know, if what you're saying is, will digitalization in a variety of forms, will, you know, the use of algorithms, data, all of those areas exist in most industries to some extent, greater or lesser? The answer is yes. So I don't see a distinction unless I'm totally missing something, which is possible.
That's okay, Roberto. We can't hear you there. Just
yeah. I had the same doubt that I was not sure that I understood exactly the question. Perhaps the question is what are the main other sectors, other areas in which we will.
That's right. Yes, yeah. And what do we need to be looking out for then with those?
I have a figure for you which could be of interest. It's that their estimations in developed economies, and I refer to that, is that 20% of the occupied population will be remaining working remotely in a way or in another, whether like an employee, whether like an independent worker, which already tells you much about how the world is changing. Not necessarily through labor digital platforms, sometimes by their own, but that's coming. And with a strong push also as a cross-border reality. I just want to stress that.
Another one of the questions, and I know that somebody did touch on it there, elaborate on the similarities and differences in practice between digital labor platforms and private employment agencies. So there's obviously quite a bit of interest in those differences and similarities.
Well, let me pick that up. I mean, again, the similarities come with all the solutions that are being delivered, and that's where the classification piece is key for us, you know. And you will receive the same benefits, the same wages when, again, that service is identified as agency work. So probably as simple as that.
Another one here as well, and I'm surprised, as I mentioned, we haven't mentioned COVID to date, but this is the reason why we're all in this unusual situation. And this emerging and developing sector is also having to cope with those challenges. The majority of employers, though, this delegate reckons, so I'm not sure if I'd use that word, but employers use COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext to change working conditions for workers and also reduce workers' benefits. How should we deal with that serious problem? Bettina, you're in disagreement there.
I'm just, you know, I'm maybe a bit naive here, but I'm still seeing enough employers out there that really, you know, are all about value creation and not reducing benefits and not reducing wages. I mean, in our days, you know, in a way, there's the war for talent out there. So there's so many businesses that are looking to have the right people, independently of the form of work. And again, the signals I'm seeing maybe it's a question of balance, but are really around, at the contrary, you know, making sure that you actually care for your workforce, and it can be a very varied workforce, and that you actually want to, you know, make sure that they're very productive, you know, the moment that the world becomes somehow normal again. So I would actually be hesitant to, you know, only come of it from that perspective of wanting to, you know, diminish. I am not saying it's not happening, of course, but currently I'd like to also just say that there's many out there who are really looking to create value again.
And I must thank you for that. Yes, just Sharon.
It's a very mixed environment, but Tina is right about, again, a small percentage of people who are competing for talent. So the upper end echelon of the educated, the well-paid mostly, etc. But we saw, and Roberto and I have been trying to prop up businesses, indeed, with supply chains that just collapsed, basically. And so that we are both on the case of saying there must be universal social protection. So a lot of workers have faced a world without work and with no benefits, or unemployment protection, you know, and other social protection, even denial of access to health. So indeed, we saw unions with often very supportive employers in a small number but key areas, actually arguing for increased or advances on the social contract around job and business support, wage guarantees, access to health, unemployment benefits, and we need to keep those advances. But what it's showing up is when, you know, 73% of the world have little or no social protection, there is no resilience for workers or for business. And it's unfinished business that has to be dealt with immediately if we're going to have resilience against future shocks. And it doesn't matter what the employment arrangements are, all workers, indeed in small to medium business owners as well, who are facing this.
And you know, just before you come in there, I must apologize to Anne-Marie, because in the great world of text speak, bios meant billions. So that will explain to you why we didn't exactly understand what that question was. It was about 100 billion relates to taxi and delivery services. So now that does make sense. So perhaps you might want to answer Anne-Marie's questions as soon as we finish here. But I suppose, want to lift the tone a little bit before we come to the end of this, and hopefully get from each of our panelists here what the opportunities are, how we can harness these opportunities, and try and look to a positive future for making change within this. Perhaps we'll start again with the way we have presentations, or you'd like
Could
to
I just go very briefly first, because I have to leave, and I'm very sorry. It's been a great discussion.
I've been clock watching on your behalf, Sharon.
Yeah, the only the thing we have to do is actually be committed to, first of all, the fact that you can't deny rights to any worker, and then work together through, in fact, a cooperative environment to say, you know, how do we make sure that this is the case, that compliance is in place? And the answer is social dialogue, not defensiveness, not trying to support sectors to pay lower wages or benefits or whatever, but actually how do we manage a labour market in the interests of everybody? And social dialogue is always the answer, where we can get it with, indeed, Mr. Secretary, the regulatory backup.
Thank you. I think opportunities are multifold and many. First of all, I would also like to touch upon one of the questions which was taken about the employer's reluctance to take additional manpower or reduce it. That is not the case. Since 1999 to 2018, there has been tremendous growth of this sector. Like the number of platforms were zero, almost zero, have risen to about 777 in the year 2020. It is indicated in the report. Secondly, since the opportunities are many, in one of the report in India, it has been indicated that the economy, or this economy, will grow at the rate of 17% CAGR and will touch 484 billion by 2024. So what I agree with that, I agree with you. So there is a need, as far as platform workers are concerned, that we need to put in place a system which creates a win-win situation, where we are able to balance the rights of the workers, balance the rights of the employers, and also create a conducive atmosphere for this, for facilitating ever-growing need of this sector for the world economic growth. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to that, Bettina?
No, with pleasure, but actually I'd like to pick up your question on the opportunities. And
thank you.
I think I'd like to really, put the big finger on just, I guess, formalizing work again. But I think for us, platforms should be, if it's well done, it's a way of bringing people to work. It's a way of actually increasing access to work. And, it's a way of earning wages. And of course, we've heard figures that are unacceptable, but we know of, many countries and again, many providers who are actually paying excellent wages again there, or good wages. And it's a way of, obviously it has to be the way of tapping into benefits. So again, it is a way of accessing work. And that's where the entire, diversity and inclusion agenda comes into it as well. There's still too many countries where, people with a disability don't have the possibility to access the labor market. Well, platforms might, and hopefully will provide that in the right framework. We've seen the big losers of this pandemic are women. Well, let's make sure that platforms are one of the ways, again, to bring women back to the labor market. And then we've heard the figures. Most, or in many sectors, platform workers are young people. Those are young people who might actually struggle otherwise to access the labor market. This, by the way, agency work is a proven way for all of these, for young women to also enter the labor market. So that's why we have this experience around it needs, these forms of work in a way, and this access to the labor market per se. So a big opportunity if it's done in the proper way.
Thank you, Bettina. And we did have to lose Sharon Burrows there. So I will leave the last comment of this afternoon to Roberto.
No, I just compliment, because I have heard what I was going to say. And I think that Bettina has been very clear. If you just take a restrictive approach, we have to preserve rights, but at the same time, we have to very well preserve the opportunities that this is bringing. And apart from the opportunities on gender, on the people with disabilities, but I also want to complement something that was perhaps not said. Entrepreneurship, innovation, many startups come from that. From the moment that you kill that, you will have a less competitive advantage as a country. So many of the individuals that are now bringing new ideas, many of the businesses that have been developing are doing it through digital means. So the way forward is to have the proper balance, not just the negative approach that perhaps we listen too much in the WEC report, but also to see how we can enhance the opportunities. And we are more than willing also to push also this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And I do want to say a huge thank you to all our panelists this afternoon. We have our government speaker there from India, Mr. R.K. Gupta, Joint Secretary, Minister of Labour and Employment, Roberto Suarez Santos, Secretary General of the IOE, Sharon Burrows, who just left us there, Secretary General of the ITUC, and Bettina Schaller, current President of the World Employment Confederation. And of course, we did hear earlier on from Uma Rami. She gave us that excellent report. And that is really all we do have time for, I'm afraid. It leaves just about enough time to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining in. I know you have loads of questions. We're hoping our panelists will be able to stay with us and answer some of those directly for you. And of course, this has been recorded, so you'll be able to watch back and then maybe get some of the answers later on off platform. This would normally be the point where I would say, let's reach a conclusion. Let's look to see where we are in this. But these weren't discussions that we're going to come to some sort of negotiations or conclusion. It was just the start of a very, very important conversation and dialogue that has got to be taken forward. It's clear there are still some grey areas when it comes to the platform economy and many challenges still to face, which is why more open and honest conversations like this one are so vital. Thanks very much, all of you, for attending. Thank you for your fascinating questions, which really did keep the discussions flowing. The webinar, as I said, will be available to watch again, and you can read more about the 2021 World Employment and Social Outlook Report on the ILO website. For now, though, from me, Alison Common, have a very good afternoon.